Good afternoon. We are representatives from the European Union as a climate change stakeholder. Firstly, we will introduce the EU and its stance on climate change. After this, representatives from 3 EU member states, France, Germany, and the Netherlands, will give a more in-depth discussion of climate change relative to their respective nations. The EU is a unique political and economic union between the current 27 member states, not including Britain, which will cease to be a member in early 2019. The EU was formed in 1993, however is founded on several treaties dating back to 1951 when the European Coal and Steel Community was formed in the aftermath of World War II to prevent further conflict between neighbouring European countries. The EU is committed to reducing anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions to combat climate change. The EU's goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2020 from the 1990 levels was already surpassed in 2014. Greenhouse gas emissions were down by 24.4% from 1990, with a reduction from 5,672 million tonnes CO2 equivalent to 4,290. This puts the EU well on track to maintaining its 2020 emission goal and reaching its 2030 goal of reducing emissions by 40%. As the EU is a large supranational entity that covers almost 4.5 million square kilometres of geographically diverse land, climate change varies in how severely and in what ways it affects each EU member state. As shown in this map, climate change and the subsequent rising of sea levels, even by a few metres, threatens to submerge parts of the Netherlands, whereas landlocked countries are evidently not as concerned with this particular issue. As another example, rising global temperatures would affect mountainous countries like Austria that must sustain adequate snow cover, particularly in winters, to support the large ski tourism industry. In fact, the following map depicts the projected climate change impacts for each specific region of Europe. The EU has 3 main strategies for combating climate change. The first involves the EU forming binding national commitments with member states to reach emissions reduction goals. The EU also makes international commitments, for example, helping developing countries to transition to greener energy sources. The second strategy is the EU Emissions Trading Scheme, which is a cap-and-trade program that includes all member states and large industrial facilities within them. The third major strategy is to promote renewable energy and energy efficiency within coal-powered reliant member states and internationally. As shown in this map, the EU already contains several countries, such as Austria and Sweden, that have been highly successful in switching to a more sustainable renewable energy industry. These countries can therefore be used to help promote and model renewable energy schemes within heavy power coal power generating and consuming countries. The EU is, however, somewhat constrained in its response to climate change. The EU comprises 27 member states which all have highly diverse political, economic, and social cultures, which inevitably leads to a diverse amount of opinions over most legislation. As consensus amongst member states is required for decision-making in the EU, it is inefficient in responding to climate change as a supranational entity. It is therefore more effective for the EU to place its efforts in encouraging member states to individually combat climate change, with building more renewable energy generation plants, for example.
The French nuclear industry is the strongest in Europe. There are 58 nuclear reactors in 19 sites across France, which at its peak in the 2000s produced approximately 75% of France's energy needs, whilst also exporting power to neighbouring countries within the EU. Recently, concerns over the quality of building materials in more than 20 of the 58 nuclear reactors has meant they've shut down, causing a reduction in nuclear power and an increase of conventional power within France and neighbouring countries as they scramble to take up the slack. The recent state of the French power network does not accurately reflect its state over the past 15 years as a reliable, clean and safe method of producing power for a leading Western nation. Compared to other countries within the EU, France's heavily nuclear-based power industry has led the way in the reduction of produced carbon emissions. Compared to the UK and Germany, countries with comparable populations but a far greater dependence on conventional fossil fuels, the EDF claims to have 1/10 the carbon emissions, and compared to Denmark, a country with no nuclear power whatsoever, produces 1/13 the carbon emissions. Thanks to the mainstream emergence of nuclear power in France in the last 30 years, carbon emissions have been reduced by 70% despite the power production tripling. France has been an example for the rest of the EU and the non-EU member European nations, showing that nuclear power can be safe and efficient as well as slashing the carbon emissions when implemented on a large enough scale. Despite this leadership in the nuclear power industry, it is likely that other EU nations will not follow suit for many years to come, due either to political motivation or the still relevant Chernobyl disaster occurring in the Ukraine in 1986. Whilst the Ukraine is not an EU member, the environmental and psychological impact of the disaster have been felt by EU member nations, making a transition to nuclear power a controversial topic of debate. Despite its aging nuclear power network, France continues to serve as a good example of how nuclear power can be safe if proper maintenance is undertaken. It has shown that maintenance can be carried out to prevent accidents, but Chernobyl serves as an ever-present reminder of the other end of the spectrum.
Hi, my name is Luca and I would like to share some interesting facts in relation to one of our union's members, Germany. Germany is one of the 6 founding countries that started back in 1950 in what initially was known as the European Coal and Steel Community. Germany plays a critical role in the development of a common energy policy. It's by far the largest energy user and also a substantial energy producer in Europe, ranking second in the production of coal after Poland and second in nuclear electricity generation after France. According to Germany's Federal Environment Agency, a comprehensive report on an adaptation to climate change has highlighted what concerning impact climate change has had in Germany. Germany, being geographically positioned in Central Europe, is witnessing an increase in warm temperature extremes, but at the same time a decrease in summer precipitation. This is leading to a noticeable increase in water temperature and a higher risk of forest fire. The initial problematic of acid rain, witnessed after World War II, that was caused by an increased consumption of fossil fuels and that resulted in destroying a large part of Germany's forests, has now developed into a much more complex problem. Rising temperatures, more humid winters, and more frequent extreme weather events complement the list of consequences nowadays. The once ideal conditions for raising crops and maintaining forests in Germany have been affected, and intense rainfalls have ultimately led to frequent flood risks. In a joint press release, the German Environment Agency, the German Meteorological Service, and the German Climate Consortium warned that the record temperatures and the flash floods witnessed in Germany last year could have been a foretaste of what the summer of the future could look like. Hence, climate change is not only affecting the environment, but also Germany's energy supply, agriculture, and healthcare program. Germany has decided to approach and tackle the climate change issue in different ways. It plans to remodel its energy supply system, aiming to become one of the most environmentally friendly and energy efficient economies. Germany is focusing on improving energy efficiency, investing in research for alternatives, and increasing the use of renewable energies. Germany's concept is to establish alternatives to nuclear power in expanding renewable energies. The percentage of electricity obtained, for example, from sun, wind, and hydro is to be expanded significantly. The government also tries to stimulate a proactive participation of the industry with incentives for manufacturing electric autos and also incentives for end customers when buying them. Although Germany is one of the leaders in driving the adaptation to climate change, it is geographically constrained in its response because surrounded by other members and neighboring countries of the EU, like for example Poland, that heavily depends on its coal industry. As previously discussed by my colleagues, much change can be difficult due to diverse opinions of other European Union members, which make it hard for legislation to be passed. At this point, I would like to introduce to you my colleague Isabel, that would link and share some further facts regarding climate change in the Netherlands. Thank you.
The Netherlands is a largely coastal country which lies very low, with approximately 25% of its territory at or below that of sea level. With 26 members in the European Parliament, the country represents a somewhat significant amount of seats in the EU. Due to its low-lying environment, the Netherlands is at great risk of suffering from ocean expansion due to climate change, despite the dikes and seawalls set up to prevent the many coastal regions from flooding. Since 1880, global mean sea level has risen by 225 millimetres in 2012, caused by the heat expansion in oceans as well as melting glaciers in the north. As depicted on the graph, from 2005 to 2300, two predictions for the rise of global sea levels have been outlined, both with dire consequences for the Netherlands. The graph suggests that by 2100, global mean sea levels will have risen approximately 40 centimetres, with several sources confirming this as a more likely third of a metre. Despite seeming like a minor change, this causes great endangerment to the Netherlands as a whole. As previously mentioned, flooding maps show that a mere 1 metre increase in sea levels will engulf the majority of both Amsterdam and Rotterdam, alongside much of the rest of the country, providing a very real threat to the Netherlands. With the use of the previous diagram, it can be determined that this 1 metre increase may occur as recently as 2150. With this threat looming overhead, the Netherlands has become one of the countries in the EU most affected by climate change and has become very concerned with the possibilities for both prevention and damage control. Currently, the likelihood of being able to stop rising sea levels before the dangerous levels predicted by 2150 is very low without global support. With that in mind, the Netherlands has invested €1 million in a global climate adaptation centre. As well as this, the Port of Amsterdam has set a goal to be coal-free by 2030, discouraging the transport and production of coal-based energies. Despite this, the Netherlands is still home to relatively new coal plants, built as early as 2015, although they face closure. It's clear that the Netherlands' best solution to climate change is to join the EU in discouraging carbon emissions, taking part in the ETS, and encouraging clean energy reforms.
By establishing a point of view on climate change through 3 member countries, France, Germany and the Netherlands, a rounded presentation as EU stakeholders has been presented. It can be seen that climate change is an issue that will challenge the EU significantly. Threats such as flooding, bushfires, temperature increases and increased carbon emissions have put the EU in a state of consciousness, in that there are many things to consider. The EU must collaboratively continue fighting issues that surround them relating to climate change. The EU must look to continue improving energy efficiency, investing in research for alternatives, and attempt to increase use of renewable energy. In addition to this, the EU must continue exploring the use of nuclear power. However, it is clear that the EU have been so far productive in matters concerning threats to climate, which will put them in a better position than most countries in tackling climate change issues in the years to come.